Have you heard of Commando Parenting? If you haven't, don't worry, in this video I'm going to explain it all to you. And if you have, well, I've got a bit of a confession to make. I sometimes help parents become commando parents, but here's how and why. If we haven't met yet, my name is Oliver and I'm a family systems therapist and a parent coach, and I love helping families become closer and more connected. I'm a little too interested in some of the parenting names that come up every other week. So the latest one across my radar was Commando Parenting. I have been on the Google and here is what I have found out. As the name implies, Commando Parenting is a style of parenting that emphasizes discipline and structure, and is characterized by this no-nonsense approach to parenting where parents are in charge and expect their kids to follow the rules. Commando parenting might not be so much about being overly strict or controlling. It's more about having rules and being very consistent with them. For some reason, Commando parenting is making a resurgence at the moment, having been made famous by Dr. Phil in 2005. So having looked at some of the recent articles, as well as what Dr. Phil said back in the 2000s, I think it's really important to distinguish between parenting styles and parenting techniques. Everything that I've read about Commando parenting leads me to believe that it's intended to be a technique rather than an overall parenting style, which is more of your general day-to-day approach to being a parent. Now, I find that to be a bit of a relief, actually, because army references and parenting children really shouldn't belong in the same sentence as far as I'm concerned. If you're interested in knowing your own parenting style, don't forget to take the free parenting quiz on mypeoplepatterns.com. If you sign up for the emails after you take the parenting quiz, I'll tell you a bit more about the free online parenting course that we have. It's all about family systems, and you can learn a little bit more about how I work and how it impacts parenting and families. There's very little documentation on Commando parenting, so if it were a parenting style and I'm wrong on it being a technique, here is how I would conceptualize it. In all of my videos on parenting styles, I try and map out where the parenting style is along the 4 dials of parenting. These dials come from the research of Diana Baumrind and Earl Schaefer, who were the pioneers of parenting psychology. Their work gave us these 4 quadrants that we've probably all heard of, and it's something that I learned in grad school. But the problem with this is that you only get to go in one of 4 boxes, which doesn't really help us account for all of these new parenting terms that come up, apparently every few weeks. I found it easier to break down the original research into individual components that the 2 axes were made of. When you do this, every single parenting style can be visualized as a different setting on each of the 4 dials. There can be an infinite number of combinations now, which will accommodate future parenting terms as well as your own. So here's what each of the parenting dials mean. Warmth is a scale that reflects the expression of warm, yummy, loving feelings that we would prefer our parents to express to us. Acceptance refers to our desire and need to be accepted rather than rejected by our parents. It's acceptance of who we are, what we're interested in, as well as acceptance of our feelings in the moment in any given situation. Control of behaviors is about the idea that our parents need to help us control our behaviors so that we understand what is acceptable in society and in family, as well as which behaviors are dangerous or unhealthy. Control of autonomy refers to the capacity a parent has to let their child be a unique individual rather than forcing them to fit in a specific box or a specific vision of who they want their child to be. We want our parents to give us the freedom to explore who we are and what we love. So if you haven't guessed it already, Commando parenting is probably not particularly high in warmth or acceptance. The military connotations just imply that this is going to be a very rigorous, disciplined style of parenting. And just like being in the army, we can also imagine that this parenting style is going to be very high on controlling behaviors and controlling autonomy. Everyone in the army wears the same uniform. We don't want individuals in an army. With decades of research into parenting and family relationships, we know that there is actually one preferred style of parenting. The most effective or the best style of parenting is one in which the dials are flexible. They're not locked in any one position. They might lean towards the higher end of acceptance and warmth and a little bit lower on control of behaviors and autonomy, but they can move depending on the situation and the needs of the child. So that means a parent can dial back on the warm, loving feelings when their child needs some space. We call this the lighthouse parent in My People Patterns world. And as you can see, the settings on the 4 dials are very different for a lighthouse parent compared to a commando parent, the metaphor of the commando parent. All of these parenting styles and terminology are metaphors. So let's take a look at what comes to mind when we think of a commando parent. So just like a Marine sergeant, the commando parent is goal-oriented, high in discipline, and has a no-nonsense attitude when it comes to dealing with their kids. The phrase "do whatever it takes" comes up repeatedly when you search for commando parenting. This implies that the commando parent is in control, has all of the power, and demands respect, or is trying to get respect through their authority and their influence. They get the job done. The military terminology brings to mind hierarchy, ranks, and chain of command. And this is an important part of commando parenting that I'm going to follow up on in just a minute. So as I was thinking about this, the movie Private Benjamin came to mind. If you haven't seen it, it's an 80s classic, and Goldie Hawn is this very privileged, beautiful young woman who suddenly has to join the army. And hilarity ensues as she adapts to military life.
I did join the army, but I joined a different army. I joined the one with the condos and the private rooms.
It's a total culture shock to her, but in the end, it's actually a very transformative experience for her. She's sort of shocked into reality by this drastic change in environment, and it's probably the intended effect of any parent who suddenly wants to shift into being a commando parent. They want to shake things up and change things. But that's a movie, and Goldie Hawn was an adult in it, not a child. And we know from research that ranges from Harry Harlow's experiments on monkeys with the wireframe mother to what we understand about rescued orphans from orphanages in Romania in the 80s or 90s, that a military-style approach to parenting is not going to raise healthy, happy young adults. So if commando parenting is not recommended as a parenting style, when would you use it as a parenting technique? As a family systems therapist, I've got a bit of a controversial view on family structure that isn't very popular, but I think that's because I'm a bit misunderstood. All I mean by family structure and hierarchy is that I want the adults, the parents, the adult caregivers to be in charge. I cannot think of a single example where it would be okay to have a child running a family. If you can think of one, please let me know. I've been racking my brain for years to think of an example. I just can't. The work of structural theorists in the 1960s and the research that followed has really shown to us that healthy young adults are raised in families in which the parents are higher in the hierarchy than the children. Depending on your parenting style, there's going to be variations in what that hierarchy looks like. If you're watching the Parent Test on Hulu, like I am, a bit obsessively, here are some examples that might be familiar to you. The intensive family has a hierarchy which might look a bit like this. And that's very different from the free-range family whose hierarchy might look a bit like this. Neither of these freak me out or concern me because in both of them, the parents are very much higher than the kids in the hierarchy. And that means that the parents in both families are in charge to varying degrees. That being said, some of my work in family therapy is helping parents adjust their styles somewhat. Sometimes the parenting style just does not match the kid's temperament. Some kids don't respond well to not having structure and boundaries, and I have to help parents firm things up a little bit. And other kids don't respond to having too many boundaries and too much structure, and I have to work with parents to soften them a little bit. So what I'm talking about is moving the dials on the 4 dials of parenting, making them more flexible. The families that most concern me are the ones that have structures in which the child is joining the parent level of the hierarchy. If this family was a company, it would be like letting kids into the C-suite and letting them make executive decisions on behalf of the whole company. I call it a democratic hijack. What this means is that the child has been exposed to too much responsibility or too much power or authority or decision making, and that is just not healthy for a child. We don't want to expose children to too much adult stuff. They're not old enough, they can't handle it, they're not supposed to handle it, and that's because they're kids. If this continues over time, a child starts running the house. And the only way that children can do this is with the very few tools that they have at their disposal. Now, adults run the household with experience, age, education. Children don't have that. What they have is threats, threats of leaving, threats of running away, threats of self-harm, threats of killing themselves, or emotional outbursts, which could be violent, angry, or just disturbing and worrying to parents. I call this monarchy by a minor, and the parents in this situation become the powerless parents. This is not a good situation. In structural family systems, as therapists call this an inverted hierarchy, and this family structure is correlated with teens who self-harm, teens who run away, anxiety, depression, all kinds of really serious stuff. So if this reminds you of your family, please get professional help from someone. This won't change without some help from an expert. What I'm about to share with you should not be undertaken by yourself based on what I'm saying. A YouTube video is not therapy, so please get professional help from a licensed therapist, and feel free to ask them if they know about structural family systems. You should feel totally empowered to ask any therapist if they've got that experience. When I'm working with a family who's got this structure, some version of commando parenting as a technique might be advisable. So the way that I'm interpreting commando parenting is that it's a technique to get parents back in power. With that being said, I would hope that this technique or this style of parenting doesn't have to last forever. I'd hope that it could soften over time. But an inverted hierarchy does often require some drastic measures, such as this commando parenting idea. So let me tell you really quickly about a family that I've used this with and how I got the parents to be commando parents. I never talk about real clients, so this is actually a mashup of various clients that I've seen over the years. I remove all identifying names and features, so this isn't really about anybody that you could ever know in the real world. So this first family had a 10-year-old, and this 10-year-old flat out refused to go to school. Over the course of a few sessions, his parents started telling me that this started off with him being sick, and then he kept on being sick, and then his parents realized that he wasn't really sick, he was just saying he was sick. Obviously, in situations like this, you do have to rule out medical conditions. This family had gone to numerous doctors, had numerous tests, and nothing biological or medical was apparent. I started asking about what happens when they don't go to school, and one of two things would happen. Number one, they would get to hang out with dad, which I gathered was actually a cool thing. They liked dad's work, they liked what dad did. So, kind of fun. Or they would stay at home with mum, play video games, watch TV. So it wasn't really much of a surprise to me to learn that pretending to be sick slowly morphed into just not going to school. This is called school refusal. It's a real thing. Staying at home, though, was basically fun. Why would any child go to school if you could either hang out with your cool dad or stay home with mum and watch TV all day? Now, the problem is you can't let your kid get away with this because it's truancy, and parents are responsible for this. It becomes an issue of child neglect, which means a child abuse report has to be filed. It gets more serious. So we had to do something drastic. My commando parenting idea was very similar to Dr. Phil's because I think he's borrowing this from structural family therapy. And it's the gold standard of what to do when there's school refusal. Over a good few sessions, I coached mum and dad with what the plan would be. And that would be packing up all of the toys, games, and electronics and putting them in the trunk of the car if the kid refused to go to school again. Dad would then take everything to work and the kid would stay at home with nothing to do. Now, how this differs from what I think Dr. Phil talks about is that this was all laid out in advance. There were no surprises here. The kid knew in advance what the deal was. If you refuse to go to school, here is what we are going to do. Being the monarch minor, they didn't really believe that mum and dad would ever have the balls to pull this off. And they did. And the kid wasn't very happy about it. But after a couple of days, they went back to school and slowly earned all of their toys and electronics back. Commando parenting for me in this case was about giving mum and dad the power to reclaim their authority. And it was tough, but it worked. Now with another family, I did something similar, but this teen was older and bigger and was a little bit more scarier for mum and dad. But I had them in advance tell the kid what was going to happen. And at night, before mum and dad went to bed, they took every single charging cable out of the house. Phone, iPad, laptop, all electronic wires were gone. And that's because they were afraid of taking the phone or asking for the phone or asking for the laptop. So instead we came up with this idea to just take all the charging cables. And of course everything ran out of power after a few hours. What was great in this case was it only lasted one morning. And I think it was mum that got a call from the kid asking very sheepishly if they could still get a ride home after swim practice that night. So the kid went to school, did swim practice, and again, slowly earned the electronics and the charging cables back. So for me as a structural family therapist, Commando Parenting works as a technique. And just to reiterate this, mum and dad do not jump into this idea. We talk about it over a series of weeks. I want mum and dad to be on the same page, to know what to do, to really make sure that they feel confident to pull the trigger on this. They have to be in unison doing this. There can be no chinks in the armor. I have to really pump them up to be Marine sergeants or commandos. Now, don't forget, I've spent a good few sessions getting a full history. I know everything that they've tried before. I know everything that hasn't worked. I've understood what goes on in the family. And then only when I'm confident that this is the last remaining decision do I get parents on board with this. So this is absolutely not something that you should rush into. I really, again, recommend you get a family systems therapist to help you out with it. So that was Commando Parenting. I hope it was helpful and useful, and I genuinely hope that you don't ever have to become a commando parent.